get this clear in my mind. So really what you're talking about is the fact that actually atheism began as a strand in France as a reaction to the church state, as it were. But what really underpinned that kind of the militant heresy bashing in France? Because you had the wars of religion which even preceded that in the 16th century, didn't you? And the
16th and
16th, 17th century. So that seems to be the very focal point and the very roots of it all, is those wars of religion.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, all of European history is conducted in the shadow of the 30 Years' War, which is conducted in the shadow of the Reformation. There are lots of different ways of looking at this. I suppose two are worth picking out. One is that...
Can we just clarify? So wars of religion is Catholic-Protestant wars in Europe, right?
Yes, yeah. Although
they had major political dimensions rather than purely religious.
Exactly. So you would have Catholics siding with Protestants against Catholics and vice versa, depending on the dynastic machinations at the time.
And what are the timescales here? When did it begin? When did it end?
Well, so in one sense, it begins right from the 1520s. And obviously, the Reformation is dated to Martin Luther in 1517. There is violence, say, in the Peasants' War in Germany that breaks out in the middle of the 1520s or so. Protestantism begins to cohere right at the end of the 1520s. But for the majority of the first half of the 16th century, violence is relatively sporadic. It becomes a bit more substantial, but still quite localised in the second half of the 16th century. But it's really in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, that huge amounts of Europe, and particularly the area of the Holy Roman Empire, now called Germany, that is absolutely devastated and loses a third of its population, maybe even half its population. It's completely brutal, and it lasts for longer than a generation. So everything subsequently it takes place in the shadow of that. And so there are two factors going on here. One is that for 100 years or so now, Catholics have been throwing arguments trying to understand the Protestant position, and Protestants have been out throwing arguments to undermine the Catholic position. And they both do quite a good job at it. So 50 or 100 years later, early atheists pick up the arguments that the Catholics and Protestants had been using against each other earlier, and then use it against Christianity or religion altogether. So the arguments are born in the wars of religion, and then they're deployed subsequently. I think one of the important things to realise in all this is that the arguments really go back to the classical world in one regard. The arguments are always the same. It's why they're used, by whom, when, and for what purpose.
And every generation thinks they're using the arguments anew.
There's nothing new under the sun.
I mean, I see that with new atheism. You read the arguments like, no,
yeah.
Like, man is a machine. That is an argument which is deployed with such, ferocity today.
Who designed the designer?
Who designed the design? These are common ones.
Okay, so let's pull some of these things together. So Europe was in the wake of these European wars of religion, Catholics versus Protestants, or sometimes together. But the macro picture was that a lot of people were fighting in the name of religion, causing a huge amount of bloodshed, and this must have really undermined the kind of the moral authority of religion, because a lot of the radicals in the past have said, well, if we get rid of religion, we won't have morality, whereas all these people are dying on the streets because of this. And at the same time, that conflict generated a lot of scriptural arguments between the Catholics and the Protestants, and then radicals later then took this with the moral authority of religion weakened, and then they got the intellectual arguments and they deployed it against Christianity. And especially that grew in areas where there was a political motive. So especially in France, where they were using this as a weapon against the authority of the state, which was linked to the church. A lot of those secularists and radicals, they kind of intimated that we would have kind of utopia, in a sense, if we had a fully scientific type of world where we got rid of religion, we rely purely on reason. And on the face of it, that seems to be what communism and what the USSR was. How did that bear out in reality?
How did that work out? Don't give any plot spoilers here. Well, one of the arguments from the book is that it was no good saying there is no God. If you live in a thickly religious culture where religion affects everything, and society, politics, economics, governance, everything is somehow dependent on the existence of God. There is no God has very limited appeal, because the challenge is to replace what you've got, not simply to pull it down. And the big fear for Europeans was, if you remove God, you remove just the everything really that holds the structure up. So there is no God might be a tenable phrase in the seminar room, but in public life you have to say there is no God and therefore. And one of the arguments in the book is that the different radicals put different conclusions to that sentence.
Right.
So some would say there is no God and no heaven, therefore we need to build heaven on earth, which kind of translates ultimately into some sort of Marxist, communist, utopian type of response. There is no God and therefore we need to maximise happiness on earth.
That's Bentham.
Utilitarianism. There is no God and therefore we need to maximise pleasure on earth, which would be the kind of view that someone like Lemaitre, one of the most radical of philosophers, advocated. And there's also, although you don't get this for a long time, a nihilistic strain. There is no God and therefore there is no purpose, so on and so forth, which you might kind of equate to a sort of Nietzschean strand, depending on how you read Nietzsche. So the best known of those is the first because it generates massive social and political systems that at one point in the 20th century are governing a third of the world. But the point is that the link from A to B isn't a necessary one. There is no God, and therefore you get linked from A to B to C to D to E.
You get lots of gods.
You get lots of earthly gods. Some of the self, some of the society, some of pleasure,